Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Creating LGBTQ Inclusive Work Environments. My name is Laurence Schwer from ESCP Business School Berlin campus. I am the program manager for ESCP's LGBT plus leadership program, and I will be your moderator today. So let me briefly introduce the topic and our speaker for today's session. Research has consistently shown that organizations which have implemented a climate for diversity and inclusion are able to achieve higher levels of innovation, creativity, and performance. However, still many employers actually struggle to create an environment where LGBT+ can be authentic at work. So today in this masterclass, you will learn about the most predominant myths around coming out at work and about what employers can do to create an LGBT+ inclusive work environment. So I'm very happy to have Professor Kerstin Alfes from our Berlin campus as our speaker today. Welcome, Kerstin.
Thank you.
So just a couple of words about Kerstin. So Kerstin Alfes is a professor of organization and human resource management at ESCP Berlin campus. She is the academic director for the full-time MBA in Berlin, and she's also academic director for the LGBT+ leadership program. This is a training which was specifically designed for LGBT+ talents. Kerstin's research interests include strategic human resource management, employee engagement, diversity and inclusion, and overqualification. So big welcome to Kerstin. And now, before we get started, just a very quick overview of today's house rules. So in the chat, feel free to ask questions during the presentation in the questions field. And at the end of the presentation, which will last around 30-35 minutes, there will be another 20 minutes to cover these questions. Also, the webinar is recorded and will be available online on ESCP homepage. You will get a link after the webinar. We'll be using Mentimeter to interact with you. So please log in at www.menti.com and use the code 689951 to interact with us. And now I pass on to Kerstin. Kerstin, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Laurence, and welcome everyone to this webinar. It's very nice that we're together this afternoon to talk about LGBTQ+ inclusive environments. And I would like to start the session by drawing from your own experiences. And as Laurence has already said, we'll use Mentimeter. So I would like to encourage you to log on to Mentimeter and type in the code 689951 and answer the question that you can see on the slide here. So to what extent have you in your own past been subject to slurs or jokes, felt treated unfairly by your employer because of your sexual identity, been exposed to stereotypes and prejudices, felt rejected, not included because of your sexual identity, and finally been pressured to hide your sexual identity by colleagues or line managers. So if you could use a Mentimeter to indicate your responses, and then hopefully we get a picture to what extent stereotypes, prejudices, and in workplace discrimination is still a relevant topic today, nowadays. I can see 8 responses. Great. Thank you very much for answering the questions, and we can see here that there are 2 aspects which seem to have been specifically relevant to your own work environment, to your own work context. most of you have indicated that you've been subject to slurs or jokes in your past, and also that you have been exposed to stereotypes and prejudices. But we can also see that the other three statements have played a role in your previous work, and therefore are still something that LGBTQ+ face nowadays. I think it's important to remember those statements, or to think about the statement when we talk about inclusive environments nowadays, because what the statements show and what your answer to those statements show is that most of you have not been able to experience authenticity at work. And this is something that we can also see when we take a look at statistics, is that a lot of employees, more than half, 53% of employees, feel that being authentic at work might have negative consequences for their career or for their social inclusion. We also see that 43% of all employees believe that fitting in is a very effective strategy in order to get ahead in an organization. And 39% feel that fitting in is rewarded at work, which means that being different, telling people that we are different, looking at each individual and their own diversity they bring to the context is not rewarded, according to 39% of employees that have been surveyed. If we take a look at the implication of being authentic at work for the LGBTQ+ community, we see that in a recent study by the Boston Consulting Group, 40% of LGBTQ employees are not out at work. And this is more than a third, so quite substantial proportion of employees working in organizations. And I think that shows, based on research data, how difficult it might be for some LGBTQ+ employees to be authentic at work. And by authentic, we mean to be their true self at work. I would like to take the rest of the webinar to think a little bit about what are the common challenges that LGBTQ+ employees face at work, specifically when we talk about coming out at work. And then I would also, as Doreen has mentioned at the beginning, talk to you, get your insights about what needs to change to create a stronger climate for inclusions. What can organizations do to foster inclusion and diversity amongst LGBTQ employees? Let's talk about common myths that have been around with regards to the LGBTQ+ community for quite some time. One of the common myths that I have witnessed, that I've experienced when I do coachings in organizations, when I do training in organizations, is that there seems to be a perception that coming out at work is not a big deal, specifically because nowadays we're in the 21st century, so coming out at work, a lot of people have the idea that this is something easygoing. When we look at the facts on the slides here, we actually know that this is not a case, which is why we've called it the first myth. When I do training in other countries, for some of them, coming out is still dangerous. So it's not just a question of wanting to come out, it's also there are severe repercussions if employees choose to do so. And therefore, the LGBTQ+ community, the whole movement, is still very much work in progress. We see differences across different countries. We also see obviously differences across different organizations, but we're nowhere near having achieved full equality and diversity. And this is why coming out at work is still a challenge from a personal perspective, but also depending on the specific context. We see that when we split LGBTQ in smaller subgroups, so to speak, that there are also quite noticeable differences between gay, lesbian employees and trans gender diverse employees with regards to their opportunity to be authentic at work and be their true self at work. And I've highlighted on the next slide an overview, another statistic which illustrates the point. You can see two maps on the slide here. On the left side, employees were asked about to what extent they would be comfortable with having a gay, lesbian, or bisexual colleague. And you can see in Europe, quite a few green parts, but very surprisingly, and obviously very sad news, also red parts, specifically in Eastern Europe. And then the second slide looks at how comfortable employees feel to be working with a transgender or transsexual employee. And you can see that there are more red parts, fewer green parts, which illustrates, on the one hand, there are still parts in Europe, which, I mean, we all read the news, so it's not that surprising. But when I saw the statistics, it's in a way very depressing to see the scope of it. We see still red parts across Europe where neither gay, lesbian, and bisexual nor transgender and transsexual employees are welcomed as a colleague. But we also see, second point, that there are differences between LGBTQ sub-communities. So myth number one, coming out at work is normal, easygoing. It's something where research evidence and also my conversations with people from the community demonstrate that this is actually not the case. The second myth that I encounter a lot is that people feel that coming out has nothing to do with work. So basically the assumption is that whether LGBTQ plus employees are out at work or are not out at work doesn't really impact the way they're carrying out the job and the extent to which they get engaged in their job. Hence, whether someone is able to express their sexual identity or whether someone is forced to hide their sexual identity doesn't really make a difference with regards to employees, LGBTQ plus employees' work performance. And I would like to challenge that myth, and I would like, again, to ask you to get onto Mentimeter and let me know what feelings, what emotions do LGBTQ plus that you know experience when they are out at work. So what are the emotions that you feel when you're able to be your true authentic self at work, and how does that maybe impact your work, your engagement with the job, and also the relationships with your colleagues? Again, I would encourage you to type your answers into Mentimeter, and we'll see the picture that is coming out here. Empowered, satisfied. Empathetic, curiosity. Liberated, comfort. Thanks for typing in your answers. As you can see, those of you who've used Mentimeter before, the answers that I mentioned more often appear in like bigger letters in the screen. And when we take a look at the overall pictures, we see that there are some emotions that you experience that are related to being worried, being anxious, maybe fearing about the consequences of coming out for your future in the organization, for also maybe for the collaborations within your team. So there are definitely some emotions related to fear and anxiety. But overall, it seems from looking at the picture that the overall emotions that LGBTQ plus employees experience when they are out are positive. So freedom is the biggest one that we can see in the middle of the word cloud here. But you also said like confidence. You said you feel like self-empowered or empowered. You feel accepted. It influences employees' levels of satisfaction. And when we take a look at how you are working and the extent to which LGBTQ plus employees are able to bring their true self to work, we realize that the opportunity to be out at work makes a big difference to how people feel when they are working in an organization. So the opportunity to be out or working in a context where this is appreciated, where you've got the opportunity to do that, actually leads to more positive emotions in generally, or more positive than negative emotions, but also higher levels of satisfaction. And I would like to share with you a quote that I have found in one of the research papers that I'm working on, which I think summarizes very, very nicely what it feels not to be out at work. And you can take a look at the yellow quote on the slide here, where basically one LGBTQ employee mentioned that it takes a lot of energy to hide at work. And I'm sure that you can relate to that experience because the employee here said that even small no-brainer questions take a lot of energy to make sure that they are answered correctly and to avoid being out at work or being forced to come out at work. Here the person said, you know, when I met the man I came to love, he wanted to tell everyone that he fell in love, but felt that he doesn't have the opportunity because obviously doing so would have forced him to be open about his sexual identity. So covering up at work drains people's energy, and therefore we see that when we take a look at research papers, but we also see that when we have conversations with employees from the community, it reduces levels of satisfaction and engagement and increases stress. And it prevents LGBTQ employees to take part in normal day-to-day conversation in an authentic way. I've put here the weekend question. So employees who are not out, you know, they often need to lie about what they did during the weekend, or they need to come up with their own stories about what they did during the weekend. And obviously, as you know, if people are forced to tell wrong stories or part of the stories at work over a repeated number of days, weeks and months, that has a major impact to how they feel at work and also the extent to which they feel integrated at work. The third myth that I often encounter when I do diversity training in organizations is that line managers, top managers, colleagues feel that LGBTQ plus employees are scared to come out just because of career risks. So the main reason for which they are not revealing their sexual identity is because they are worried that this has a negative implication for their career. And when I talk to LGBTQ plus employees, I realized that this probably is only part of the picture. And again, I would like to encourage you to use Mentimeter to discuss with me what other reasons LGBTQ plus employees might have for which they do not come out at work. Is it only career, or are there other reasons for which? Career, not getting promoted, yes. Okay. Being judged, being subject to slurs. Yeah, violence, job loss, glass ceiling. Victimization, not fitting in. And being ridiculed at work, change of friendship. I've seen bullying at work. So you can see again from the cloud building up that yes, a glass ceiling, career-related reasons not being promoted are part of the reasons not to reveal the true sexual identity. But we see here that actually there are many other and maybe more important reasons for why it's sometimes difficult for LGBTQ employees to come out at work, mostly related to discrimination, either from colleagues, someone said change in friendship, or from line managers, homophobic boss. So it's not necessarily that it's difficult to come out because people feel that their career is impacted. Instead, it's more the social connection, the social isolation, or the fear of social isolation that prevents LGBTQ employees to reveal their sexual identity. And the picture that you have nicely put up using Mentimeter is also what we find when we talk to LGBTQ employees during diversity training. The lack of support past experience with discrimination, the big fear of being socially excluded, to be subject to jokes, to be put into a corner, to be stereotyped, are often much more important factors than purely thinking about, does that impact my career development? So what we also see when we talk to LGBTQ employees during diversity trainings is the importance of having a strong supportive social environment. And that can be colleagues, that can be line managers, but also obviously like personal friends make a big difference with regards to employees' willingness and employees' courage to be out at work. We have spoken about authenticity at work. Like, this is where I started my my little webinar about statistics showing how difficult it is for many LGBTQ employees to be authentic at work. And I would now like to take a different perspective and ask what can be done, like what can organizations do to create a context where it's maybe easier or more straightforward to be authentic at work, and where all employees, including LGBTQ employees, can be their true self at work. Organizations that are very good at being inclusive, they create a work environment, as you can see in the yellow box, where everyone at work feels accepted, regardless of their background, their identity, and their circumstances, where everyone feels supported, and where all employees have the opportunity to succeed at work. So career and promotion decisions, the opportunity to give the feedback, the opportunity to be part of communities at work, to voice concerns, to help the organization grow and develop, is not restricted to a certain majority of employees, but more generally, all employees in an inclusive environment have the same opportunities and the same chances in an organization. And that means that practices need to be designed in a fair and non-biased way. That starts with recruitment, and we know that LGBTQ have already are faced with stereotypes at the recruitment and selection phase, but it continues up until training and promotion decisions. And we know that LGBTQ are often disadvantaged when it comes to promotions decisions. So in an inclusive climate, promotion decisions are made based on people's performance and not necessarily based on any characteristics. Second criteria of an inclusive environment: organizations which have an inclusive work environment, they allow employees, all employees, to be themselves at work without any recrimination, and they make an effort to signal that they value differences, not for the sake of being diverse, but for the sake in believing that all employees, no matter which category they belong to, have something specific to bring to the table. And final aspect of an inclusive work environment: an inclusive work environment is characterized by processes where all employees are included in decision making, and where organizations make a specific effort to acknowledge that minority groups have maybe great ideas and some specific perspective that is worth considering. And that obviously contrast non-inclusive environment where key decisions are often taken by the majority group, and therefore without any consideration of the views, of the concerns, of the position of minority groups. And we see when we take a look at organizations that we're working with, but also when we take a look at research evidence, that organizations who've been able to create that climate of inclusion have a lot more positive outcomes, first with regards to obviously how people feel at work, but also with regards to their long-term performance and their attraction in the employer market. LGBTQ inclusive organizations have a big advantage in terms of attracting LGBTQ employees, and that's something that they obviously specifically value. I would like to get your ideas again, based on your own experience and maybe also based on what you feel is missing nowadays. I would like to encourage you to submit your ideas. What do you feel organizations need to change or do more of in order to improve the inclusion of LGBTQ+ employees? I'm curious to see your suggestions, and then obviously I will also present some of my ideas. But first of all, I'd like to know from you, what is it that organizations can do to create those inclusive environments where LGBTQ employees feel that they can be their true self at work? Yeah. Get some more. Yeah. Language. Yes. Start a dialogue. Yeah. You can see your answers on the slide here. Obviously, when we scroll through, you've highlighted many important aspects. I think the first one that I've found is a very important point is forcing. Someone said forcing white male to attend trainings, and I think this is a very important point. Like training in general, there were more comments around training. Training top management, training the key decision makers about about LGBTQ employees, about diversity in general, is an important aspect if we want to make sure that we create an inclusive environment. You've also, there were some comments which say understand what we are feeling and understand our fears and get to know us better, which I think is not only the role of top managers, but also obviously colleagues, line managers. So getting into a dialogue around what are LGBTQ+ employees' fears, what are their worries, what are their concerns, what ideas do they maybe have in terms of what can organizations improve, is another important aspect that organizations can do. And then there are structural aspects that I've seen, where you said gender neutral bathrooms are quite important. Checking whether recruitment practices and selection practices and promotion practices are really bias-free and not stereotyped. I don't think that all organizations are ready yet to check this. So I think that's a very, very important point to tell organizations. If you hire majority employees throughout, check whether you might have a bias in your recruitment, selection, and performance appraisal system. And then support organization, the community lobby are another important aspect that you have brought out on the slide here, which kind of shows that organizations can do a lot to signal that they believe in inclusion and that they believe that it's important to support the LGBTQ community. So overall, I think we had almost 30 suggestions and clear sanctions. That's actually another important comment. Demonstrate that LGBTQ phobic acts are not tolerated in an organization, rather than saying, oh, that was just a joke, oh, that was just a mistake. Make sure that there's a clear boundary and that everyone in the organization is aware of those boundaries. Therefore, language is another important point, where I feel that many organizations use a language that is definitely not inclusive, and therefore start stereotyping or prejudicing at the moment when they, for example, send out invitations. So great suggestions. I will share this with Laurence, who can then send your solutions or your suggestions on to everybody who's here in the webinar. And I think what you've suggested more or less mirrors what my suggestions were. So I'm not going to go through all of my suggestions in detail, but instead maybe just highlight the key aspects that I feel have not been mentioned or are probably relevant in order to create an inclusive environment. I've split my answers a little bit with regards to different stakeholders and organization, HR departments, review workplace forms, recruiting practices, gender neutral bathrooms, and dress code, something that you have already mentioned, which I think is oftentimes the role of HR departments in organizations. I feel that top management on the right side here has a very important role to play in making sure that they create an inclusive culture. We know that top managers' endorsement of, for example, LGBTQ initiatives, or them openly saying that they want to have LGBTQ employees being promoted, being part of the top management team, being part of the board, has a huge influence with regards to the acceptance of LGBTQ employees in the workplace. So top managers have an important signaling and an important role to play with regards to fostering an organizational culture that is focused on inclusion. Therefore, one important aspect with regards to that is also an understanding, which I feel sometimes is missing. And this is why, the first comment on the previous slide, force top managers to attend training, is a very relevant point. If I talk to top managers, to boards, and ask them, like, are you inclusive? They always feel that they're very inclusive. But then when I dig a bit deeper, it becomes clear very soon that this is not the case. So I think a general understanding that diversity is a value, an important value, is something that top managers need to achieve. Allies and line managers are the second or the third and fourth category where I feel people can make an impact and can play a role in achieving inclusive environments. I think that specifically the role of allies is very, very important in the LGBTQ community and in supporting LGBTQ initiatives. And what I've always found most powerful is if allies show why they're supporting LGBTQ initiatives, and also share their own experience about why certain initiatives have benefits, but also generally, state open why they want an inclusive environment and why they feel that LGBTQ rights are an important topic to discuss. Because the more people openly talk about discrimination, harassment, and bullying, and talk about how detrimental this is for individuals and for the organization, I think the better and quicker it is organizations are able to change their culture. And I've noticed that in many more open and inclusive organizations, that the vast majority of employees are fully supportive and openly discuss the importance and the values that are linked to inclusive environments. And then line managers, some of you mentioned homophobic bosses on the one of the previous Mentimeters. So what I feel line managers can do is educate themselves about LGBTQ concerns, about LGBTQ movement, but also critically ask themselves about whether they share values and whether they implement practices that are truly inclusive. Again, when I do diversity training, most line managers feel that they're perfectly fine and that it's just a coincidence that they don't have an LGBTQ employee in their team. And then when I tell them, we've got a team of 15 and we don't have an LGBTQ employee, maybe that shows something about the work culture that exists in the team, then they start thinking and then they start questioning. So I think coming back to the idea of offering training, it's also important to give people opportunities and to force people into those opportunities to self-reflect about their values and their approaches, and also what they communicate to others. Because when we know that the line manager is fully supportive of LGBTQ initiatives, we know that this has a very, very big positive impact with regards to the extent to which team members are coming out at work. I would like to conclude my webinar by going back to the research by Boston Consultancy Group, which has just been published. And they have developed a model which nicely summarizes the different steps that organizations can take in order to create a truly LGBTQ inclusive culture. The first basic level is developing non-discriminatory policies and making public statements that they support the LGBTQ initiatives and that they foster LGBTQ equality. Second aspect, building infrastructure, and this relates to what some of you said in terms of make sure that LGBTQ get equal benefits, that they're gender neutral bathrooms, that policies and practices are checked in order to make sure that they're discrimination free. And then the final step, driving in an inclusive culture, designate a confidential ombudsman. I know that was also some of the comments that you had, very important, so that there is a spokesperson and someone that can also illustrate and highlight wrongdoings in an organization. And then training. There's like lots of research, as I said, that demonstrates that giving training to the workforce in general, but also to line managers and top managers specifically, has a big impact with regards to creating an inclusive culture. That's all I wanted to share with you during this this webinar. I'm going to say thank you very much for listening, for participating in the Mentimeter, for giving your answers. And I will hand it back to Laurence, who will manage the chat and let me know if you've got any questions.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kerstin, for your presentation. And indeed, we already have a few questions. Now also feel free to add your questions. We have around 20 minutes to cover those questions. So maybe just starting with a comment from Johannes that we know from last year's LGBT plus leadership program. Hi, Johannes. He was just mentioning something which, an interesting comment, mentioning a challenge with mandatory trainings, that they seem to be counterproductive as they spawn microaggressions, and that voluntary trainings have shown to be successful. Maybe can you relate to that? Is there any evidence also on that side?
Yeah. There is evidence very clearly supporting what Johannes has said, that forcing people to do a training limits what they take away from the training, and sometimes people just don't want to go. But I think there's a nice way around this, and some organizations are quite clever on it. For example, if I know that the organization is maybe not 100% inclusive yet and that they have still work to do, I would never offer a diversity workshop for top managers. I would offer a leadership workshop, and as part of that, would talk about diversity issues. I think by putting diversity training maybe into another bigger training, that can actually ensure that top managers who maybe would not want to attend the diversity training would then be willing to attend the leadership training and at the same time get the positive learning experiences. But I mean, I 100% agree, and I think we know that from ourselves. If our line manager tells us you have to attend that training, I don't think that this is, the right atmosphere to get the best learning from out of that.
Great, thanks a lot. We have a question regarding how to communicate with the leadership team. So it's a question from Lee. She says more and more organizations are having diversity officers to build a diverse and inclusive work environment, but mentioning that these leadership teams doesn't really, if they don't commit to it, it's hard to achieve the goal. So one of the biggest challenges is to persuade the leadership team to commit to the cause. Do you have any suggestions how diversity officers to help them communicate with the leadership team more effectively?
I do feel that for organizations who have maybe started their inclusive journey only, so at the start of the diversity and inclusion movement, I feel that the best way to get the ear of top managers is to present the business case. And unfortunately, you know, while I think that inclusion is bigger, it's not about the business case. It's about more like a moral, you know, value in my view. But for organizations who are at the start of the diversity journey, I feel that by showing that diversity and inclusion enables organizations to attract more talent in the job market, to show higher performance, to be more innovative. I think that is something that line managers, top managers, maybe listen more to, compared to saying, you know, I want the diversity initiative to be supported because of the diversity initiative. That hopefully then is a second or third step.
Okay, thanks. Now we're having a question more about best practices. Mara is asking, do you know an example of a, well, 100% inclusive organization might be a bit tough, but maybe nearly 100%, and what makes them different from other organizations?
And there are a lot of organizations out there that which openly support, for example, LGBTQ initiatives, and do that in a credible way. Like one example that I personally like is IBM. We've got like we're in touch with IBM, so we know a little bit about their movement. And what I like about their approach is they have got so many different subgroups, and they've got so many different initiatives, and there is just you know, general view that IBM supports all sorts of different initiatives. And I think this is something that maybe differentiates more advanced, more inclusive organizations also from other organizations, that they also see inclusion as something that crosses that goes across different workforce groups, and they really look at the value that each employee can bring, rather than having like a gender diversity policy or having like an LGBTQ policy. So for them, it's about a lot of, you know, more subtle differences, and they really encourage people to network and share their experience. And this is something that I feel is best practice in inclusive organizations. The idea is not on groups like on big groups anymore, but on small, almost like value-based diversity aspects.
Thank you, Kerstin. We have a question from Alexander relating to the situation in homophobic countries. How do global brands can improve LGBTQ acceptance in those countries? Can you recommend any practical steps that can be taken?
I think it's a very, very challenging question to answer for me, to be honest. And I feel for organizations, on the one hand, they wanna do business and often need to do business in these countries. On the other hand, they would like to improve the conditions for LGBTQ in these countries. I don't have a specific recommendation, to be honest, because I think it also depends a little bit on the situation, on the country that we're talking about. But oftentimes homophobic countries, they've got a culture where homophobia is so deeply ingrained that it's probably difficult for organizations to change this unless you know, they partner with other organizations and start to slowly work on progress in terms of, it's almost about educating the country and not business partners. That's my experience, that homophobia is almost ingrained in the culture. So there needs to be a movement with regards to changing society rather than changing business practices.
Thanks, Kerstin. That was indeed a very tough question.
Yeah, that was a tough question.
I have a question from Etienne. How can we differentiate pinkwashing, or what we call pinkwashing, from a sincere, inclusive culture and policy?
It's I think that like the whole discussion around pinkwashing is quite interesting, I think that when we look, for example, at advertisements, we see some organizations that have been really smart in designing job advertisement and in designing product advertisements, which are very much LGBTQ oriented, and then we see other organizations where we feel that doesn't feel right. So one way for me to differentiate pinkwashing from maybe a true inclusion interest is credibility. And that goes both with regards to how to product our market. I think we see that a lot of time organizations try to create inclusive marketing advertisements, and sometimes it's well done and sometimes we feel no. So there I would think maybe that was just for pinkwashing reasons. But also, you know, from a maybe HR perspective, because that's my my expertise, if I do diversity training and I've got an organization who explains to me that they're the most inclusive organization ever, and then I've got in the top management, I've got 8 white men aged 40-44 sitting there, who've all got like pictures of a wife and 2 kids. I'm asking, you know, if you feel you're inclusive, why is that not represented in the board? So I think that by understanding how the organization tick and by looking at some key facts, we can differentiate pinkwashing from a true inclusion approach, also, you know, from an HR perspective.
Thank you. There's a question, or rather an invitation to comment from Jean-Luc. According to him, the LGBT community has itself a big role to play, let's say through LGBTIQ employee networks or mentoring program, role models, and so on. Do you have anything to add or comment on that?
I 100% agree with this, and I would say get the allies on board. You know, don't reduce or focus the movement on LGBTQ employees only, but get more supporters on board, because the stronger the movement, the more initiatives there are. It's a change in people's mindset that is necessary with any diversity aspect, also with regards to LGBTQ diversity. It's changing people's mindsets, and therefore the more people are on board and the more people support initiatives, the bigger the spread is going to be. So absolutely 100% supportive of that comment.
Okay. We're having a question from Doreen. She happens to be the only LGBTQ+ person in her organization, of 15 people at the offices here and 20+ abroad. She wants to know, how do I best help management ensure their recruitment practices are inclusive?
My first comment would be to check whether you feel that the recruitment is biased. So I'm assuming that you might be part of you know, some of the selection processes, and I would you know, try to highlight where do you feel that the selection is not done in an objective way, because when we select employees, we want to select that person who is you know, the strongest performer, and therefore when do you feel during selection conversations that the selection is not focused on performance but other aspects? And if you're the only LGBTQ in your organization, maybe focus on other types of diversity at the same time, because we often see that if there is a bias in a selection process, it's not only bias towards gender or bias towards LGBT, it's generally biased. So you might actually get the support of other diversity groups in order to showcase very specifically where do organizations go in the wrong way. And what I find is quite useful, I've seen some organizations provide this, but usually it's like bigger companies. But what might be a good idea is to do like a short PowerPoint presentation, 3, 4, 5 slides, to illustrate what are common biases in recruitment and selection. Because again, when I teach and talk about biases, most people are not aware how deeply ingrained their prejudices are, and to what extent they bias against others when they're recruiting. So it's not necessarily a question where I would say that line managers recruit in a biased way because they want to bias. It's more a lack of awareness. So by giving an overview, by demonstrating the type of biases that people make, the type of prejudices that influence specifically selection decisions, I think you might might have a good opportunity to make this more salient and make it more transparent, and give people an opportunity to self-reflect. So lack of knowledge is something that I very often observe when we talk about selection and recruitment practices in organizations.
So making more awareness then on that sense.
Yeah, general awareness of the pitfalls that we have when we make decisions.
Yeah, thanks, Kerstin. We still have quite a few questions. I'm not sure that we'll be able to cover everything, but I have 2 questions. Maybe we can connect them, because David is asking if you could tell a bit more about intersectionality, and at the same time I have Johannes addressing the actual topic that is going on right now, that companies and leaders are very much focused on racial justice at the moment. What arguments could you leverage to ensure they look beyond what is currently in the news, and we capitalize on the momentum to drive a broader inclusive conversation? Maybe that can relate to each other, both of the questions.
Yeah. The intersectionality is a very important topic, because LGBTQ in a way cross other different workforce groups, right? And we know that employees or women who might be women, lesbian and black has got a lot more disadvantages compared to other groups in the workforce. So being part of a minority group, or being part of multiple minority groups, disadvantages people even further. So there's no kind of threshold after which the situation stabilizes. So I feel that part of the discussion is that the different minority groups have focused on their cause for a very long time. So there is like a very strong gender movement in some organizations, and we've got an LGBTQ movement in organizations. Now there is racial discrimination as a hot topic. There are still other diversity groups which don't have that much of a big lobby, but still are important. And I often think about people with disabilities who don't have that strong voice in society compared to maybe the other groups. I feel if you're working with diversity initiatives, if you've got a diversity team in your organization, I think it's important to talk to them and to discuss with them to make sure that diversity is not a hot topic. So today it's racial diversity, tomorrow it's gender again, and we've got LGBTQ, but that if we wanted to move to a really inclusive environment, those categories don't matter anymore. And therefore, I think organizations should move towards creating initiatives where people are almost like connected based on the values they share, not necessarily because of the different groups that they belong to.
Okay, thanks. I think we have time maybe for 1, maximum 2 more questions. David is asking, he's campaigning a lot during the Pride Month, encouraging people to show their support, but received very, very little adherence. So what would you suggest is the best way to have more allies?
It would be interesting to see what you have done, obviously, in terms of campaigning. My feeling is that one-to-one or small-scale conversations are much more beneficial than bigger campaigns. I think people at the moment, specifically because of the current Corona COVID situation, I think people's minds are somewhat occupied with a lot of other things. So my experience, if we want to create a big ally movement, is talk to people more individually, network, go to have a coffee when you're allowed to have a coffee again, go to lunch and dinner on a smaller scale. I think that's a lot more powerful than specifically in the current time than big campaigning. I know it's maybe a smaller movement, but I feel it's a more sustainable approach and maybe a more suitable approach in the current time.
Okay, so let's have one last question from Lee. So he's saying that he's asking, does the company's attitude towards diversity and inclusion depend on the industry in which the company is active? And do you have, from your experience, specific industries that are more keen to improve diversity and inclusion?
It does depend on the industry or in the sector. Like we see, consultancy type organizations often, or service sector, professional services firms are usually leading the movement. What we see is that depending on the type of industry, there's also different focus with regards to diversity. So if you go to more tech-oriented companies, or if you go to more manufacturing organizations, then the focus is more on gender diversity because they want to have female engineers, right? Whereas in other types of organizations, the focus of diversity might be different, and that is to a large extent influenced by the sector that companies are operating in. What we see, however, is that what matters maybe more than industry sector is the value of top management. If we have, and research has very clearly shown that if we've got top managers who believe in in diversity, we believe in inclusion, who might have previous experiences with regards to discrimination, bullying for whatever reasons, who might have friends who've been bullied, discriminated. So if the value of top management is diversity, inclusion, it has a huge filter down effect because it influences the culture, as we've talked about before. It influences HR policies, it influences KPIs. So for me, sector is an important component. Top management value and mindset is an even stronger and more important component.
Thanks very much, Kerstin. And unfortunately, we are running out of time. We still had a few more questions. I feel that there's a very lively discussion going on. I thank you very much, Kerstin, for those insights. Thank you for all of you who joined us today and for your very interesting questions that led to this lively discussion. I hope that you enjoyed the session, that you gained some insights for yourself, but also for your company or your organization. And if you want to learn more or share some further thoughts and feedback, feel free to reach out to us. And also, if you want to gain more insights, you can also join our LGBT+ leadership program, which will start on October 22nd this year. So please feel free to get in touch with us. Thank you very much for attending today. Take care and have a lovely day. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.